Michael Beckley. I'm the director for Asia at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and it's a pleasure to welcome to all of you today to today's event. Thank you to all of our sponsors and our members for the support so that we can put on programming like this and sponsor this type of research. I'm really thrilled to have Dr. Sheena Chestnut Greitens here with us to talk about preparing for the long game, U.S. strategy in a protracted China conflict. Dr. Greitens is an associate professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at UT Austin, where she directs the Asia Policy Program. She's also the editor-in-chief of the Texas National Security Review, probably the premier publication for policy relevant, historically and theoretically informed analysis of geopolitics. She's also one of the sharpest analysts at the intersection of authoritarian politics, as well as Indo-Pacific security and US foreign policy. And during her time as a fellow at FPRI, she worked on this fantastic article, which has been published in the Washington Quarterly, where she argues that the United States really needs to rethink what a war with China might look like, that it's not going to be this splendid little short and decisive war, but could perhaps be a prolonged, complex, and unpredictable conflict, and that the United States needs to basically get out ahead of this problem right now. So over the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to unpack the key arguments of the piece, then work our way through what it would actually mean to plan for these protracted scenarios. If you want to ask questions of Dr. Greitens, please put it in the Q&A box, and I'll be sure to work them in at various points into the discussion. So Sheena, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for working with FPRI, and congratulations on a fantastic piece.
Well, thanks very much for having me today, and really thank you to you and to the FPRI Asia team for your support and the support of the Templeton Fellowship. It was really a pleasure to work on this piece, and I'm glad to see it out in print and have the chance to discuss it today. So thank you.
Well, the piece is really remarkable, but it's also kind of depressing to read. You essentially open the piece by arguing that U.S. defense planners are preparing for the wrong kind of war with China. So can you, as a table setting exercise, can you just explain what you see as the core problem in the way that we're approaching potential conflict with China, and then we can go on to some of your recommendations for how to fix it?
Sure. The United States, for a long time, has tried to envision a scenario where it could, if it had to be engaged in military conflict with China, keep the conflict short and decisive and really win in the opening phase. And what we've seen over time is as China's military capabilities have grown, that there are increasing number of policymakers, strategists, planners, inside and outside government saying, this is maybe not the way this is going to go, that the specter of a grinding war of attrition, similar to the one we've seen in Asia or in Ukraine, but in the very different geographic and political context that Asia has, just that might be a much more what the United States and the PRC need to be contemplating when they think about the stakes and costs of any potential conflict. And over time, we've actually seen the language getting even more specific over time. So we've gone from talking about China as the pacing challenge to talking about Taiwan as the pacing scenario, which was usually the language used by the Biden administration. And then if you credit the reporting in the Washington Post on the interim national defense strategic guidance that's been issued by Secretary of Defense Hegseth, it actually narrows it even more and says, well, the pacing scenario is a Taiwan scenario, but it is a fait accompli attack to seize Taiwan. That's what we're going to center our planning, training, and equipping on. And the problem is that's not the only way the United States could find itself at war with China, even over Taiwan. And then there are a whole host of scenarios outside of a Taiwan scenario that are very serious security flashpoints in Asia. So, part of the motivation for writing the piece was this concern looking at the complexity and the high stakes of the regional security environment in the Indo-Pacific and saying, hey, we don't want to plan for just one scenario and find ourselves then either failing to deter or fighting a war that isn't the one that we planned and prepared for. That won't be a good thing for the United States. And so I wanted to flag some of those concerns for policymakers as soon as possible.
Well, let's get into some of the scenarios because the title of the piece, Pathways to Protraction, plural, that protracted war isn't some single scenario, but it's really a spectrum of complex evolving contingencies. Can you just give us a quick overview of what some of those scenarios are, and then we can maybe dial down into some of them, and then and we can go from there.
Yeah, sure. So I will say during the time that I was working on this piece, protracted war was becoming a focus of the U.S. defense establishment. And I'm a non-resident visiting faculty member at the U.S. Army War College. I should note here that none of what I'm saying or writing represents the opinions of the Army or DoD, which I think they probably are thankful for. But one of the things as this sort of notion of the potential looming specter of protracted war has gained traction, it's really important to acknowledge is that planning for protracted conflict with China isn't a single state of conflict. It's the sort of convergent result of a bunch of different flashpoints, and each of those flashpoints, if they escalate, could converge into some kind of broader end state that we call protraction. But what resources are going to be available in that conflict and what kind of conflict it actually ends up being depend a lot on how the starting point of the conflict originates and what that pathway is that the combatants, the US and China, and maybe a whole range of third countries follow to actually get to that protracted conflict end state. And so, the first thing to think about is that, a Taiwan invasion, right, the pacing scenario for DoD at the moment, is not the only pathway by which the United States could find itself embroiled in escalating and ultimately grinding protracted conflict with the People's Republic of China. For example, the United States has mutual defense treaty obligations with at least two countries, Japan and the Philippines, that apply to areas under stated US government policy, apply to areas where the PRC is contesting control, particularly in the maritime space. The Senkaku Diaoyu Islands for the case of Japan, and areas of the South China Sea, Scarborough Shoal, Second Thomas Shoal, places like that in terms of the US defense treaty with the Philippines. So those are scenarios where the United States could find itself in a conflict that originates in some other location or place that doesn't necessarily, at least in the origination, involve Taiwan. But even if you look at a Taiwan scenario, focusing only on a fait accompli invasion scenario ignores the fact that there are these other lower level coercive operations that increasingly seem to characterize PRC strategy toward the island. And there's a great piece by Evan Montgomery and Toshi Yoshihara in the same issue of the Washington Quarterly that looked at some of these broader coercive tactics. And there's been some good writing on the use of gray zone operations, where the threshold for response and escalation is if you're trying to deter these activities, is really complicated. There's the possible use of internal subversion, potential assassination or decapitation operations short of a full invasion. You could think about a more limited offshore island seizure that the PRC could try to carry out to separate Taiwan from some of the offshore islands that it currently controls, or something like a blockade combined with cyber operations and political pressure, all of which would be carried out under the nuclear shadow of China's rapidly advancing nuclear arsenal. So, I mean, just from the beginning, right, that gives us a bunch of different locations, different countries, and different tools or strategies that are all at play. And that generates a really wide matrix of scenarios. And the issue is that the US and its allies are going to have different capabilities, both political and military, to address each of those. So if you just think about the US-Japan alliance, which, there's been a lot of work to build up and strengthen the coordination mechanisms in the US-Japan alliance. But how that plays out is going to look very different if the US is supporting Japan in a crisis over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands versus if the United States asks for Japanese support in a military operation that starts in Taiwan or even in the Philippines. And the other thing that's going to vary is what kind of diplomatic off-ramps or channels of communication you have. And then third, what is the risk of horizontal escalation? For example, there are some scenarios where we might be more worried than others about the idea that North Korea could take advantage of instability elsewhere in Asia and preoccupation by the United States military to try to engage in another provocation of some of the kinds that it's done in the last 10 or 15 years. So the point here is that this is a really complex security environment with a lot of different scenarios, and sort of picking one and trying to deter that runs the risk that our planning is going to be overly narrow. And so that's the sort of starting point for the title of the piece, Pathways to Protraction, is that these initial pathways really set the table for any potential protracted conflict that might follow.
Before we get into some of those scenarios, why is it that Washington and the defense establishment is so focused on the fait accompli scenario over Taiwan? Is it just because that would be the most massive, potentially catastrophic event, because that would be the one that's most fast moving? Or is there some sense that if you're prepared for that, you can always call an audible and do something in the South China Sea, that it's probably easier just given the distances Chinese forces would have to travel? Or is it just bureaucratic politics, myopia, something at the top? I mean, you spend a lot of time talking to defense officials, and presumably they've thought of all of these scenarios at some point, and yet, as you point out, the planning assumption seems so narrowly focused on the big smash and grab operation over Taiwan. Why is that?
Yeah, so I think that actually there are different sets of actors across the United States government that have each thought about some combination of these scenarios, but we run the risk that you've got one part of the US, even the DoD, talking about and planning for one set of contingencies, and you've got somebody else planning for a different set. If the Army's planning is different than the Navy's planning, then at some point there could be gaps in capabilities or authorities or plans that are deadly for U.S. forces, and we don't want that to happen. So some of it is making sure everybody is really looking at the same planning scenarios and the same range of planning scenarios, so that we don't end up on a different page and have to try to coordinate that once a crisis has started. But in terms of why DoD has focused on this Taiwan invasion scenario, I think there are a couple of reasons. To be completely fair, it is the sort of catastrophic risk scenario where you have very little time to respond and have to immediately start implementing whatever plan is in place. And so I think it's the combination of the compression of time and the catastrophically high stakes that lead to a focus on that as sort of the worst case outcome, right? And that's reasonable. Every planner has to prioritize some scenarios as more likely or more dangerous than others. And I don't want to suggest that there's not a legitimacy to that, right? To that prioritization. The other thing is that I think there's been a lot of discussion and in some cases a misunderstanding of some of the things that Xi Jinping has said. And I know there's open debate about this even among China experts, but my read on the 2027 deadline that he gave the PLA is that it was a deadline to be ready for a Taiwan contingency, unspecified, right? Not a go by date. It's a ready by date, not a go by date. I think that might have been Admiral Paparo's language in some congressional testimony recently. And I think that's a really important distinction. But I also understand that then if you're a planner, you're not wanting to be ready the week before that, right? You want to be ready the year or 2 years before, and with plenty of time to plan and be ready in advance for a deadline that your pacing threat might have set. And so I think that it's a combination of bureaucratic politics working back from a deadline that is sometimes a little bit misunderstood. And the reality also is, as US defense officials have pointed out, that China sets deadlines and sometimes it doesn't hit them on time, right? One interpretation of what Xi Jinping is saying is that he, is pushing the PLA to be ready because he's worried that without pressure, they won't be. They've got these corruption problems, they've got other problems. If he doesn't apply political pressure, it's a party, it's a party army. If he doesn't apply that pressure, then they won't be ready in time. And so he needs to set that planning timeline. That's kind of standard one interpretation. But I think the other reality is that the PLA has hit some of their sort of benchmarks earlier than the timelines that they laid out. And so there's also this concern that, okay, they say ready by 2027. If they're actually ready by, January 2026, we don't want to be caught unprepared because we aren't going to be ready until June. So I think that it's that combination of things, a little bit of bureaucratic politics by responsible, folks in the military services and in the DoD. I think there's, a little bit of misunderstanding of some of what Xi Jinping has said. But then there's also just the fact that this scenario that has become the pacing scenario does have catastrophic risks and less time to try to de-escalate them. And so it's also, I think, natural that that becomes the focus. So again, I think it's an understandable problem, but that doesn't mean that we should be comfortable with the that or that we shouldn't look at what the risks or downsides are of focusing our planning too narrowly, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and do you have a sense of what the most likely entry points into the war would be? Like what key flashpoints could trigger that? I mean, you've sketched out a whole gamut of them, and I'm wondering, is your advice just you just have to prepare for all of these, and that's just the way it goes, and so trying to assess likelihood is probably a fool's errand? Or do you have a sense, I mean, maybe take your defense planner hat off and put your analyst scholar hat on and where you're actually making these kind of probabilistic judgments. Do you have a sense of like if a war goes down, how it's most likely to begin? And in particular, if any of these entry points are things that the US can have an impact on, that they're not just driven by what's going on in China, but can actually have be affected by whatever the United States policy is.
Yeah, I would have said probably that I thought Taiwan was some sort of version of a Taiwan scenario, probably an accident or unintended escalation that then neither side can really back down from, might be the most likely. I don't think you can rule out the amphibious assault or some sort of pressure blockade activity, particularly if China ever feels like its political window on Taiwan is closing. And so. But also I've been really concerned by some of the actual sort of developments on the water in the South China Sea between the United States or I'm sorry, between the PRC and the Philippines. And I think that if someone gets killed in any one of those scenarios, um, then it becomes a sort of qualitatively different political discussion with a lot more at stake and a lot less room to try to find a peaceful method of crisis management. In terms of, what the United States can do, deterrence, especially vis-a-vis Taiwan, has always been this mix of trying to make the cost of the military pathway to resolving Taiwan's status so high for the PRC that they're not willing to run the risk and pay the cost of engaging in the military pathway of resolution. And at the same time, right, ironically, successful deterrence also depends on Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership being convinced that they have a not just a chance, but a better chance of achieving what they want with respect to Taiwan via peaceful or at least non-military, non-kinetic means. Because they're probably still going to be coercive. They are coercive, but without sort of the open, full use of military force. And it's that second part that I think is really a very complicated conversation between the United States and Taiwan, because the United States should probably not lecture Taiwan on what to do. I don't think that would be well received or effective. But there is a reality to not pushing across rhetorical red lines just for the sake of rhetoric that runs very high existential risks for the people of Taiwan if the rhetoric doesn't actually significantly improve their security or their quality of life in any meaningful way. And I think that's a pretty serious conversation to be had on an ongoing basis between the United States, Taiwan, and probably some other actors in the region. Um, but in my view, that conversation is best had behind closed doors. I don't think all of that needs to go back and forth in public because it risks becoming sort of performative for electoral audiences or subject to electoral calculations. And I don't think that's helpful for the United States, the people of Taiwan, or peace and stability on the Taiwan Strait, which ultimately is what, I think we're most concerned about.
What might be some things that could make Beijing think that peaceful means of unification are just not going to happen and therefore cause them to shift even further into the military realm? I mean, obviously a declaration of independence, but I assume there are many lower level things that you're saying behind closed doors. Basically, the Americans and the Taiwanese should get together and just make sure they're on the same page and just avoid unnecessary provocations. I'm wondering what those things might be and how many of them can actually be shaped by policymakers, because some people say, look, the Taiwanese people are just evolving in a more independent direction, their identity, their wishes for their long-term future. And so, at the end of the day, there's not a whole lot of control you can have over that. And so if you just play the crystal ball forward, it just looks like Taiwan is going to be drifting further and further from the mainland, even if there never is a declaration of independence. So like what might be some of the lower level provocations, and to what extent can they actually be avoided through top-down government policy?
Yeah, I mean, so first, I think that the United States has typically had the right approach, which is to focus on the importance of process rather than any specific outcome. And that is that the process has to be arrived at peacefully, which for the United States does not mean coercion, short of military operations, but that it needs to be arrived at peacefully with the consent of the parties involved. And so I think that is a really important principle, and that needs to stay because that's what gives room for the people of Taiwan who live in a functioning democratic political system where they choose their leaders and they choose a lot of their own policies, right? That allows them to have a say and to consent to the outcome. And so I think the U.S. focus on process is actually really important. It's a little bit hard to explain sometimes why that's been such an important cornerstone of U.S. policy, but I think that continues to be really important. Second, I think it's really important. Beijing has really laid out in the 2005 anti-secession law the things that might lead them to conclude that the window is closing. And one of the things they say is, okay, if peaceful means to pursue unification are exhausted. But the other thing that they talk about, which is I think the second of three conditions that they outline, has to do with major incidents that risk making unification much less likely or not possible. And I actually think that's an important conversation to have, not just with Taiwan, between the United States and Taiwan, but probably to have with the PRC as well. What counts? And here there's a really tricky game because the PRC has an incentive to convince the United States and Taiwan that everything counts, and therefore they shouldn't ever do anything to assert any sort of self right to shape their own future. Um, and so there's an incentive to engage in strategic communication here, but I think it's really important where possible to try to figure out what are the actual red lines in that condition, because that's where you might see an escalation. And at least then, if okay, we're coming up to this red line, then you can either try to head it off or, if necessary, prepare to respond. And so I think that when I think about what needs to happen to it's really avoiding the risk of misunderstanding leading to inadvertent escalation, that I think makes these conversations pretty important. And they're difficult to have, and probably not going to be had in an environment of high trust, that you can take what the other side's saying at face value. But I think they're really important, for understanding what each side's thresholds are and trying to have as stable a deterrence framework in place as possible.
Okay, well, you're an expert on authoritarian regimes. You've written extensively about that. And so the process you've sketched out, I mean, it seems like it requires a fair amount of precision and cool, calm, collected, calculated decisions and a clear laying out of guardrails and red lines. And I'm wondering, when you look at the decision-making apparatus in Beijing and whoever Xi Jinping has surrounded himself with, and in the wake of recent purges, we have someone in the audience asking in particular about the purge of He Weidong, but there's many other purges going on there. How sensitive, and I guess precise do you think the decision-making apparatus is in Beijing, such that if you were to have these backdoor negotiations, you could sketch out a fair number of pretty clear red lines and hopefully lead to some confidence building measures? And conversely, you mentioned the deterrent aspect as well. Do you think that Xi and the rest of his comrades are sensitive to subtle changes in the local military balance, such that if the US puts certain systems in the area that are just going to make an operation over Taiwan much more difficult, that kind of information will get filtered into the calculations that Beijing is making? Or do you just think, at the end of the day, a dictatorial regime is generally not going to process information well. There are internal processes going on that are going to radically shape the decision-making process. And as a result, it's just very hard to have this kind of modulated conversation with Beijing and keep conflict under wraps.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to weight the authoritarian nature of the CCP's decision-making system pretty heavily. And I think it creates some major risks because it creates a lot of uncertainty about how decisions will be made, what information is getting to key actors, and therefore how to influence the decision calculus on the other side of the Taiwan Strait. So, we don't actually know a lot about Chinese thinking on protracted war. There is the classic text by Mao by that name, but if you try to go look at more contemporary operational texts, at least from the open source information, sort of the best advice you get from the Chinese, strategists talking to their own military is don't do it. It's a bad idea, don't do it, which is in some ways kind of similar to the U.S. desire to achieve a sharp, decisive, fast victory. Um, so we don't really know a ton about how China would approach a second phase of conflict if the opening phase doesn't go the way that they want. And that's a pretty major factor. But the other thing, and this is where I think it gets to the purges and why they're important, is that it's going to matter for the state of any potential protracted conflict what the PLA looks like when the conflict actually starts. And so we all know, I think, that China is rapidly expanding its military capabilities, but it also still has some key gaps in demonstrated capabilities that it would need to invade and occupy Taiwan, right? And the U.S. is actively trying to make that harder, as our Taiwan defense planners. So this fast changing relative military balance in Asia, I think, does matter both for deterrence and then for the operational levels of any future conflict. But the anti-corruption piece of this comes in a couple different ways, and I think they create higher uncertainty and unpredictability. First of all, ongoing problems with corruption can affect the pace and quality of actual weapon systems development. And Xi Jinping could think that weapon systems are more capable than they are, and therefore sort of overestimate China's ability to engage in a quick, decisive military victory. The other thing is he might overestimate the ability of the defense industrial base, if it's deeply corrupt, to sustain a warfighting effort, again, past that opening phase. And so therefore he might think this is going to be easier, right? You think about Vladimir Putin, who, by all accounts, had a plan to sort of end the Ukraine war in 3 days or 3 weeks. And when that failed, has ended up in a conflict that was maybe not what the Russian military envisioned either. Um, but then the sort of the last factor where I think these corruption problems or corruption scandals really matter, I'm very much with the recent New York Times op-ed by Phil Saunders and Joel Wuthnow, which I would commend to anybody who's interested in this. That these at this point we've gotten to investigations of military leaders that Xi Jinping handpicked for each of their jobs. And this likely means that there is just a fundamental problem of trust between China's military and the party leadership. And it's very hard to know how that could affect Xi Jinping's perception of what kind of risks he's running, and therefore, what his threshold for engaging in any kind of military conflict is. It also means that if a conflict starts, he may intervene in the management of the military in ways that are not entirely predictable, right? Most of us have seen the famous bunker scene in the movie Downfall, Der Untergang, which I use in teaching actually because it's this great illustration. It's now turned into an internet meme. But before that, it was and is a great illustration of the pathologies of authoritarian warfighting and how the ability to, or the sort of inability to understand what's going on the battlefield, especially when it's bad for that regime, lead people to dig in or take risks that from a military standpoint are inadvisable. And so that affects, I think, both the potential that Xi Jinping could be more risk acceptant, and think he's going to embark on a conflict because he thinks it'll be easier or he'll be more successful than he is. He'll overestimate his chances of success. The other thing is that once a conflict starts, if he's not getting good information on what's going on the battlefield, we know information problems are endemic in the Chinese political system on the domestic side, from, stuff around coronavirus to, reports of corruption at the local level to, economic statistics, right? We know that information does not get in a reliable, unbiased way from the bottom of the system to the top. And if that happens on the battlefield, again, that may also make Xi Jinping much more reluctant to find an off ramp, to find a de escalatory path. Again, the risk that you run there is that raises the likelihood not only that you're going to end up in a conflict in the first place, because there's an overestimation of how strong China's position is and how low the risk is, but also that once a conflict starts, that if a leader thinks it's going better than it actually is, they're not going to see the need to find an off ramp. And so it could actually make it harder to find a negotiated solution that makes any conflict shorter, and the costs, less costly, I guess.
Yeah, can you actually elaborate on some of these points? Because this is so interesting, I think so fundamental. So are you saying there may be a disconnect or at least a difference in a sort of misalignment in perceptions among some elements, some high-ranking elements in the PLA and Xi in terms of their attitude or outlook towards Taiwan or the United States? And then second, do you think, like, to what extent does it actually matter? Because it sounds like what you're saying is, the top leader will just dig in. And so if they are gung-ho about the conflict, they'll just push aside anyone that doesn't agree with them. I think, the Russian case is instructive. Russia sort of shambolically stumbles into Ukraine. And I remember people saying, oh, the oligarchs are going to rein Putin in or try to take him out. You had the Prigozhin mutiny, where people were saying, oh, the Russian people will eventually backlash against this costly war once more and more people are being driven to the front lines. And yet it seems right now that Russia has been able to secure its war footing. Maybe its long-term future is not bright, but in terms of just reorienting the system around this war and allowing Putin to keep prosecuting it for years, suggests that even when you do everything wrong at the start, that if the dictator is all in, that the system will basically fall in line. So would you expect something similar to happen in China's case, or are the systems just so fundamentally different from one another that you could see a different kind of pathology taking place?
I think at that point it's going to be very, very hard to predict, and we should probably develop some indicators for looking at internal cohesion in the event that there's some sort of Taiwan contingency or Taiwan conflict, and look at how that affects social stability. Because ultimately, I see Xi Jinping is very, very driven by the desire to secure regime security. And, I have often heard from external observers, Americans, Chinese counterparts, that one of the things that inhibits Xi Jinping from taking the risk to try to seize control of Taiwan is that if that fails, that could be a sort of existential risk to the CCP's position as the leader of China's political system and society. I've never been quite clear on what the pathway is by which, failing to take Taiwan, if you try, actually jeopardizes regime survival. But I'm, for the sake of deterrence, very glad that appears to be a major concern on the Chinese side. And I think that it is important because I think how social stability looks in a Taiwan scenario is potentially on the Chinese mainland is a really, really important factor in how subsequent decision making will get made. Now, you could see a rally around the flag effect, right? That's common, in especially the early phases of a conflict. But over time, if you start to see cracks or fissures in support, then I think that will divert attention and potentially skew how China actually conducts any sort of second or third phase of operations. But as it relates to sort of the perceptions, one of the things that's interesting about Xi Jinping's concept of regime security is that he consistently attributes internal dissent or internal instability to foreign black hands, to foreign subversion, to external infiltration. He sort of put them, I wrote a piece for China Leadership Monitor about how he's kind of put the Ministry of State Security on steroids in terms of its counterespionage mission and rhetoric on Chinese social media. Um, and so if I think there's a risk that if that gets applied to Taiwan and the CCP underestimates, as Russia appeared to do in the case of Ukraine, the potential will of the people in Taiwan to resist. Now, I think Beijing is trying to use subversion, political warfare, espionage to undermine the will of people in Taiwan to resist, and try to convince them that their best outcome is to seek some kind of negotiated solution from a position of weakness. And so there's a part of cross-strait policy and of Taiwan's own governance and what Taiwan's government has to think through, um, that has to deal with this question of societal resilience and the ability to be, to survive the opening phase of a potential Chinese operation and to stick together and to have that will to resist, because that's been absolutely fundamental in the case of Ukraine. And I don't want to overdraw the comparisons or analogies, but I think it's a really important lesson. And China, the United States tends to look at cross-strait dynamics through a very military lens. And China's political system obviously looks at that as well. That's why they're investing as much in the military capabilities that they are growing as they are. But they're also very attuned to the political dynamics. And very attuned to the idea that the sort of population on Taiwan is its own center of gravity, along with the military balance. And I think understanding that there are active efforts to shape that in PRC favor, most of which have been pretty unsuccessful, as you mentioned earlier. But that doesn't mean that China's not paying attention to that and trying to shape it in back the other direction to the extent that they can.
Okay, well, once a conflict begins, how might it evolve past the initial phase? I think one of the great things about your piece is you basically lay out a framework with multiple questions along the way that give us at least some sense of some of the various scenarios and the pathways to different forms of conflict. So regardless of how it breaks out, whether it's some kind of, you have a lot of hardware interacting in the South China Sea, for example. And so, as you mentioned, some kind of accident or inadvertent escalation could occur. Or maybe there's a provocation over Taiwan, maybe something completely unexpected. The North Koreans do something, and all of a sudden the US and the Chinese are confronting each other. How does this conflict evolve beyond the initial phase? What are the latter phases, and whether you want to talk about the horizontal escalation avenues or vertical escalation, just what are some of the things that actually might surprise some folks about how you see a conflict evolving between the US and China?
Yeah, let me say one more thing about the opening sort of phase of the conflict that I think is going to matter a lot for what that subsequent protraction or subsequent evolution of conflict looks like. And that's, this is all occurring. All of this discussion we're having and all of the scenarios we're talking about are occurring in a regional security environment where the U.S. has multiple allies and partners. And China has to decide how it addresses that fact from the get-go. And here it actually has potentially competing logics, which affect who's on the chessboard, with what capabilities, and on what time frame. And that really matters. So what I mean by that is that politically, Beijing's incentive should be to avoid internationalizing the any crisis, for example, over Taiwan, or keep a crisis localized to just China and the Philippines. And so what it should do then is actually try to drive a wedge between whatever country is the flashpoint where the conflict starts and everybody else in the region. So it wouldn't attack any forces or anywhere else in Asia. It would signal to other countries that they will benefit by staying involved. Hey, this isn't your fight. Don't inflame things, don't escalate. And, also try to kind of slow down other countries getting involved, because that can trigger domestic political debates over whether and how countries should intervene that just sort of slow down the coalescence of a potential coalition to defend Taiwan or somebody else in Asia. The problem operationally is that this leaves certain important assets on the regional chessboard, so to speak. And so the PLA might actually be tempted to go the other direction and try to strike some of the most important assets preemptively. US bases in Japan, right? If you can take out certain facilities or assets in Japan, that could really complicate the US effort to reinforce or support Taiwan, especially on an extended basis. The problem is, again, like China, to get back to the authoritarian political system, is that, China's decision making has become so personalistic with the centralization of power in Xi Jinping's hands that figuring out which logic China is going to follow is as much a question of psychology as it is of sort of political analysis. And I actually think just the inherent unpredictability of China's decision making has gone up as Xi Jinping has centralized power because it depends on one person and we don't really understand the informational and sort of prioritization inputs he uses to make those decisions. So I think that's a really important factor. And so that has a big effect on what happens next because it affects who's actually involved in a conflict, who would have to be at the table to settle it, what capabilities they have, right? Japan and Australia have a lot more capabilities within a certain sort of time frame and geographic proximity than some other partners, and so that really matters. But I guess to get to your what you were asking about, what happens if the opening phase doesn't go the way that one or both sides thinks it's going to? I don't know anybody who thinks that if there is actually a crisis over Taiwan and it doesn't go Beijing's way in the sort of first phase, days to weeks, that Xi Jinping will say, okay, never mind, I didn't really mean it. Y'all can come home now and bring the PLA back to the Chinese mainland. And so, you know, the conflict is likely to transition to some other kind of state that looks different than the opening phase, whether it's a blockade type scenario, which is a very different kind of planning scenario than defending against an amphibious attack. Right? So planning has to account for the fact that protracted conflict may have these phases that require completely different planning and capabilities. The other thing is that, if a conflict doesn't go the way that one or both sides thinks, both sides in the US-China conflict could face changing risks of nuclear escalation, right? So if there are catastrophic risks or really high casualties in the opening stage, or the United States engages in an effort to take, certain air assets or ISR capabilities off the table that are sitting on the Chinese mainland, that may look like a not just a defense of a regional partner or ally, but a much broader attack. And there may be, Caitlin Talmadge and others have written about the potential that poses to give China a sort of use it or lose it incentive when it comes to certain nuclear assets, because they're co-located with some of these assets that would be important in a Taiwan scenario. And so I think, thinking about what are the risks of nuclear escalation, how do we know, and how do those change over time, is going to be really, really important. Then the final factor is domestic public opinion, and the domestic economy is probably also going to matter a lot for thinking about any conflict if the opening phase is not decisive. And these things are all going to interact with each other, but it really shapes, how the defense industrial base can handle munitions production, or what the U.S. shipbuilding capability is, or what the ability is to mobilize manpower or do logistics. Really shapes the capacity over time for long-term mobilization and sustainment. And it's also going to shape the domestic bargaining space for any attempt to, again, try to find an off-ramp at whatever point the leaders in the countries involved that decide that they want and need to seek an end to the conflict. So those are just all things that are going to change over the course of the conflict, and whatever the opening phase looks like is probably not what it would look like if we shift into a longer protracted conflict. And one reason why I think this is important to talk about is actually that if either the United States or especially right now China thinks that it has the option of a short, lower cost, decisive war, it's really important to signal that we take seriously the fact that that is not likely to be the case. And if that helps deter China from engaging in some sort of military adventurism by making clear that we think the costs are going to be way higher than they're planning on, then that's an important diplomatic and deterrent signal as well. So it can actually ideally not just help prepare for conflict, but also make it less likely in the first place, which I think should be the goal.
Well, where do we stand on that? Because I mean, you begin the piece by basically saying the Pentagon hasn't really been planning for protraction, at least in the systematic way that you would advise. You mentioned briefly that it's not clear if the PLA is as well, but I've heard a lot of people say, well, look, first of all, it's an authoritarian regime. They can bear down in a way that a democracy can't. Xi Jinping has been going around telling young Chinese people to get ready to eat bitterness and prepare for extreme scenarios and stormy seas. They've been stockpiling food and energy and trying to sanctions proof their economy and just engaging in this massive military buildup. And some analysts think China just does scale, just manufacturing scale much better than the United States. Its shipbuilding, its munitions production are all much greater than that of the United States. I'm wondering whether you think that means basically the PLA is much more prepared for protraction and therefore deterrence from the US side is very weak because the Chinese can kind of game this out and say, look, even if that first wave of whatever we do doesn't go well, we can always outlast the Americans with a combination of superior resolve, authoritarian brutality, and just sheer manufacturing mass. We're kind of turning the American playbook against the Americans. And oh, and by the way, we've also seeded a bunch of malware in American infrastructure, and so we have that strategic option in addition to our growing nuclear arsenal. So do you look at all that and think that the PLA is just much better prepared for protracted war at this scenario, or do you think that like some of the manufacturing stuff in China that's not going to work in a world where trade suddenly stops and China has no inputs or is potentially cut off from energy imports? And therefore its whole manufacturing machine will eventually grind to a halt. I mean, like how does this actually play out? And then we can maybe talk about how each side views its preparations for protraction and whether we think deterrence is robust or weak because of it.
Yeah, I think the answer is a little bit of both. So I remember doing some Senate testimony a few years ago with Matt Pottinger, who was the Deputy National Security Advisor in the first Trump administration, and there was some question about China's greatest strength and the greatest strength of the United States, and his answer on the Chinese side was scale. And I think there's a reality to that that makes this a very, very hard defense and national security problem for the United States. Right? There is a reality to China's ability to produce things quickly at scale and deploy them. And they don't always have to be world class, right? So I think the United States has world class defense technology. It is the best in the world in any number of cases. But mass has an important quality in warfare. And the reality is, if you only have a few of any particular ship or drone or what, pick your asset, right? It can be exquisite and the best in the world, and if it is gone in the first 5 minutes of conflict, and you still have 10, 15, 500, 50,000 mediocre Chinese drones left, that matters, right? And so China doesn't always have to be match the United States on quality if it can deploy the advantages of quantity. And when and how that matters in these different scenarios is probably too detailed. I could ramble about that for days and not give you probably a good, clear answer on how that plays out across the range of scenarios that we're talking about today. I just want to make the point that that is real, it's important, and it's part of what makes this such a hard problem. The other point that I think is important is that China is preparing for and does in some cases appear to believe that it is going to be better than the United States at withstanding certain kinds of sustained pressure. So I was in China a little bit in April, and what was interesting to me was this repeated message from people I was talking to in China that they had the advantage in terms of determination, resolve, and ability to withstand a little bit of pain on, and again, this was purely on the economic side. This was after the Liberation Day tariffs. But the sense was you guys have to deal with domestic political pressures and different parts of the US government, and we are more disciplined. We've been preparing for this for a while, and we can withstand this pressure because we think you'll blink first. And that was a really interesting set of conversations to hear. And the reason I bring that up, right? Tariffs are very different than a full scale military conflict. I am not equating the two, but Xi Jinping's comprehensive national security concept has a really important connection between development and security, and having the security to continue China's economic growth, or at least to survive economically throughout a security crisis, is, as you note, really important. And China's watched what happened in Ukraine, watched what pressure was applied to Russia, has taken steps to try to insulate itself from if similar pressures were to be applied to them in the future. And I think they've really looked at and thought about, okay, how do we lower the pressure that can be applied if we decide this is an option we have to exercise? There's some sort of conflict that we feel is necessary for Chinese, the CCP's interests to fight. How do we minimize the pressure on the system to the extent we can? And if we can't, how do we do political education, ideological indoctrination, strengthen party discipline so that people are prepared and disciplined and united, cohesive in their response? So I think, all of those, again, more political factors influence how China sees its ability to, withstand certain American attempts at deterrence, is one way to think about it.
Okay, well, let's make this conflict even messier. Do you see U.S.-China war having a catalytic effect that will bring in other actors? I mean, you've studied North Korea for a long time, and you mentioned very briefly, like you could see a scenario where North Korea takes advantage of the chaos going on to make its own inroads on the Korean Peninsula. Are there other actors? I mean, I assume Russia is certainly going to take a U.S.-China war into account and what it's doing in Europe. So how do you have any sense of what the potential knock-on effects might be, and whether you think that'll basically it'll spiral into a vast multinational, multi-front, essentially a world war type scenario, or do you see these things as fairly hermetically sealed, or that maybe some of these other potential scenarios are sort of minor sideshows, and therefore the real focus can still be on the clash between the United States and China?
I I really hope not. The scenario you're describing sounds absolutely terrible and costly to absolutely everyone involved in the world. And so I think there's some recognition, even among America's various authoritarian adversaries, that the United States has thought about to a certain extent the prospects of coordination. And there's been some, again, recent. I wish these conversations had started sooner, but better now than never. Conversations about what we sometimes call strategic simultaneity or simultaneous conflict on the Korean Peninsula and else somewhere else in Asia. And the reality is that the forces and the capabilities involved are somewhat different, right? The United States has spent decades. The Army has a much larger role on the Korean Peninsula than it might necessarily have in a largely air and maritime scenario in other parts of Asia. So there is at least some division of labor. But there's also a lot of rethinking what U.S. forces on the peninsula look like, given that the ROK military has become as capable a fighting force as it is today. And I think you're starting to see that now with some of the discussions that have recently been reported, statements by Bridge Colby and others, that it might be time to look at having the ROK military take on more of a leadership role in deterring North Korea on the peninsula itself, so that U.S. forces Korea can be a little more flexible. They're not going to be uninvolved in peninsular deterrence or defense, but they may also look to be a little more flexible to support other regional contingencies. And I think that's going to be an ongoing set of conversations. It's too early to say where those are going to go. But I think that's the kind of conversation that indicates that the United States is thinking really seriously about what is it that only the United States can do, and what is it where adjusting burden sharing financially or in terms of division of labor with allies and partners, this might be important. I also think you're going to see, increasing European attention to what is happening in Asia. Um, Again, this depends a lot on sort of how things go with Ukraine and to a certain extent the conflicts in the Middle East. But I think that there's no question that the perception that conflicts that were previously unthinkable might not be as unthinkable as we thought, is now very much present in the minds of European decision makers because they're living it in Ukraine or in discussions about Ukraine every day. And so the idea that this could happen somewhere else too has now, I think, become a much more realistic possibility. So any power that has a global economy and an interest in global peace and security starts to care about all these complex flashpoints in Asia and how to manage them to try to create, again, more peace and stability.
Great. Well, last question, sort of what do we do about it? Let's say you have President Trump, you have Secretary Hegseth sitting here watching the FPRI broadcast. And so when you talk about planning for protraction, what does that mean in terms, and what would be different than what we're currently doing? So whether that means just increasing munition stockpiles, or as you mentioned, there could be a more alliance burden sharing in other theaters on the Korean Peninsula in Europe so that the US can focus on gearing up for a long war in maritime East Asia. What exactly would change in terms of defense planning if policymakers were to take what I think is your rightful call, that we need to really be thinking in terms of potential protracted conflict here?
I think so first of all, I want to be speak with the appropriate amount of humility here because I don't have access to the classified planning process that is going on, and even the interim national defense strategic guidance was reported in the press but isn't public, right? And so it's very difficult to say, you know, criticize something that you haven't seen, right? And I want to be appropriately mindful of that. But I think the biggest thing that I'm concerned about is that throughout history, great powers have often found themselves fighting conflicts that were not the ones they thought were most likely and were not the ones they planned and prepared for. That's been true from the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor or World War II, and the sort of, United States engagement in the Second World War, through to the global war on terror. Right? I don't think anyone on September 1st, 2001, thought that the United States would have the kind of military involvement in places like Iraq and Afghanistan that it necessarily did in the subsequent 20 years. And so I think it's really important to try to identify the most likely scenarios, and prioritization is legitimate and appropriate. But there also need to be people in and outside the United States government who are saying, okay, how do we know if it looks like something could be coming that's not what we've planned for? And when do we adjust our priors about what's most likely? Um, so I think probably the biggest thing would be just an appropriate caution from history. This is one of the things that I think, when I edit pieces for TNSR, that we think about and talk about a lot. What do we learn from history? One of the things I think we learn from history is the need to be prepared for the unexpected. And so in some ways that's frustrating guidance. And again, I'm trying to be appropriately sort of nuanced in terms of talking about the need for prioritization. But I am really worried that one of the things history teaches us is that there's a very good chance that this conflict isn't going to look like the one we're picturing and preparing for. And we need to have that flexibility and those outside options and plans in place to deal with the unexpected. It's just a responsibility that I think all of us have who work on defense and American national security.
Well, Professor Sheena Chestnut Greitens, thank you so much for the careful research. I think your message at the end to prepare for the unexpected applies just as much to life as it does to US-China conflict. So we'll take that to heart. Thank you really for all the great work that you've done. Congratulations on the article. We'll send this out far and wide to try to help spread the word. And we hope that the powers that be take your recommendations seriously. Thank you so much.
I appreciate it. Really, thankful for the opportunity to talk about it today, and thanks to you and the team at FPRI for what you do.
Great. Take care. Bye, everyone.